my god, it's back! He's gonna do a full rebuild again. This is gonna be a multi-hour video, I guess, where we will be rebuilding the Apple TV Plus page. And why the Apple TV Plus page? Well, because it looks really sexy and because there is some really interesting animations on there that I want to show you. So let's take a quick look at Apple's version and also the version that I have created. So Apple's version, of course, has some really nice videos and images on there that I didn't want to steal because I didn't want to get any copyright claims. So what this page looks like, if you start scrolling, you see that the text fades out. There's these USBs fading in. You keep on scrolling, and then there's this massive image for the current show. Then that image scales down, all of the other images fade in place, there's these carousels, everything is popping up. And that is exactly what I want to teach you in this video today. So before I show you the end result, make sure to also check the timestamps down below. If there are parts that are interesting to you and others are less, because we will really start from zero, make sure to just skip the timestamps and go to the place that interests you most. But to go to our end result, what you see is pretty much the same result, although there's not that many sexy images that Apple has. But the same thing happens, you keep scrolling, the text fades out, then there's these USBs fading in, then there's this very large image, and you keep on scrolling and you see that everything falls into place and scales down, and also these tiny carousels below it are also fading in. So with that, we're actually combining all of the different elements that Apple also has on their page, just a little bit less sexy because we don't have their nice images. I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. Let's get building. So let's get this project started by using Vite to set up our project. Let's run Vite to create a new project with pm create Vite and then a dot for the current directory. And then it's gonna ask us to set up a framework. We choose React and we're also gonna choose TypeScript. And then we already have a basic Vite project. Of course, you could also decide to go with Next, for example, but to keep things simple here, I opted for Vite. So if you look here, you see that Vite already added a few files for us. We're gonna run pm install, so we install all of the dependencies. Next, we're gonna run my own custom CLI command that adds things like Tailwind, Prettier, ESLint, all of these things, but it's still in alpha, so please don't use it just yet. I will make sure to make a video about it once it's ready for use. But if I run this, I simply get a few questions where I'm able to select all of the tools that I want, and for me, it's all of them. And then we're also gonna create a TailwindCSS file and a CSS file, and that will simply install all of the dependencies that we need. And with that, we have a fresh app set up. So let's open this in Visual Studio Code and briefly explore what we got. We have a very basic empty Vite project, but we do have a post CSS config, Prettier config, Tailwind config, just to get us started without us needing to do a lot. A few things we still have to clean up though is a little bit of the boilerplate that Vite adds. So for that, we're gonna go into the source directory and then we're gonna delete the app.css as well as the index.css file. And then we're gonna take a quick look at the styles.css file that is generated by my CLI, and that simply includes the basic style sheet that Tailwind needs. And then we're gonna go into the other files that are used, remove the old index file, and here remove the app as well. And then we're gonna clean everything up that we don't need, which is pretty much nothing. And then inside of our app.tsx, we're gonna import the styles.css. And with that, we pretty much have everything set up to get us up and running. Oh, there's, by the way, two more directories that I wanna delete. That is this assets directory that we don't need, as well as the public directory. So let's delete that as well. And with that, we have an empty project. So let's make sure that we run pm dev. So we start up the dev server, and then we're gonna open this URL. If we open that, we see the hello world that we've just added. And let me tell you, this is where the boring stuff ends, because now we will start coding and do some fun stuff. So the starting point for everything we will be working on is this app.tsx file. Everything we will be building, we will be doing in here, and of course we will be creating component files, but this is what we use instead of, for example, a route in Next.js where you would build everything on the home route. For this example, we will be building everything in the app.tsx file. What I always like to do is I tend to go back to the design and have a brief look at what type of components or sections I can see within a design. And then I always like to create these different types of components already, so I have some sort of scaffolding from where I can start working. So looking at this design, you see that we have a header component, then we have some sort of hero, And once we scroll beyond that, there's also these kind of, maybe you could call them USPs, something like that. Then we have this 3-column layout. And then we go towards the posters of all the different videos. So what I like to do is I like to create empty divs as scaffolding for these elements. So let's get that set up first. Let's change our div into a main because we probably want to wrap most of it inside of a main element just to be semantically correct. And then I'm going to wrap everything in a React fragment as well. So that way I can already add a header component outside of our main where our main nav will probably reside. So in there we get Apple TV Plus, for example, and then we have our main content here. And if we go back to that main content again, you see that we had the hero component. So let's just start adding just a little bit more. Hero component. And then we get USPs. Then some sort of 3-column layout, which could also be very well part of the USPs. 3-column layout. And then we get the carousel with posters. Because doing that, this already gives me some sort of framework to work with. I can in a second give elements, for example, a specific height. So we already have some distance to scroll, which can be useful if we're making these animations, for example. So first things first, let's start by creating that header component. I think it would be wise if we immediately would start creating a components directory inside of our source directory, so we can add all of our components in there. So let's create a new file called header.tsx. And in there, we're going to export const header. And that in this case will return the header, and then we're going to add the Apple TV Plus in there. So that means we can go back to our component or our app.tsx, and we can add the header in there. So we already have some kind of separation. Okay, now let's make sure that we start adding the header in there. But this is also the very first moment that we start to encounter a little bit of colors. So if you watched my last video, you see that I don't really like to extend the Tailwind theme, but rather like to create my own custom defaults. If you want to know why, definitely make sure to check out the video linked up here as well, because I think it's very useful. So that means that if we're going to start by adding some colors, that we of course need to know what colors we need to add. So let's inspect this element, and then we're going to see that we have this blackish color, which is 111. And if we scroll a little bit down, then you see that we also get this black background, and it could very well be that this is a different black color. And yes, if we inspect it, you see that this one is really fully black. So for that, let's go back to our theme and let's start by adding a few variables in there. We're going to open our Tailwind config file, and as you can see right now, it is still empty. We're not going to use the extent for now, but we're going to add our own custom colors. That means that as soon as we start doing this, we're going to remove all of Tailwind's default colors. But in our case, that's exactly what we want, because I don't want people to use background red 300 within Apple's website, because that's not a color that Apple likes. So the first color that I want to add is the color background. And that color is the 100% black color. And then the next color we have to add is that black color that is used inside of the header. However, if we also keep on looking throughout the rest of the website, we also notice that there is, for example, some black text. And if we inspect that, for example, this text, we see that the black color is again slightly different than the black color that is used inside of the header. So of course, we now need to look through the whole page to find all of the different types of colors. But usually if you're working in a team, you'll probably have some sort of design system where all of the different colors are already defined. But if we look through the rest of the website, then it seems that all of these other black colors are the exact same color and are kind of the text color. So if you scroll down and you take a look at this black button, you see that it is exactly the same color as this black text as well. So it kind of seems that the only other black color that they are using is this black color that's part of the text and probably buttons. And now comes the hardest thing, or one of the hardest things of development. What are we gonna name these colors? Well, it's probably debatable, but the most important thing to remember is that this is not final. If you encounter something else or the designer comes up with something new, then you might need to rename everything. And the most important thing is to keep on doing that. Keep on renaming things if it starts making more sense. As long as you keep doing that, it will work out in the end. And then the name you give it today doesn't really matter. So that means that we go back to our config, and I'm gonna name our 111 color, I'm gonna name background contrast. So it's some sort of almost contrast color that you can use to give a little bit contrast on top of the background. Not sure if that's what Apple would call it, but at least that's the name we pick for now. And then we're also, while we're at it, gonna take this other color, the 1DF, and that will be the color for text. Or maybe you even wanna name this text black. That could also make sense. And then the other thing we're gonna need to also make this header is the white color. So let's see if that's fully white or is it any different color. Yeah, that seems to be fully white. And what about this button? It has a border, but if we take a look at the background color, that's also fully white. So we're also gonna add white in here, which is full white. And with that, we already have 4 colors that we can use to make our header. So let's start by doing that. We're gonna add a class name on here, and then we're gonna add BG background contrast. And you already see that Printer is auto-completing here based on the config that we added to our Tailwind config file. So all of the other colors are suddenly gone as well. And that's actually what we want. Then next to the background, we also need to add some padding on the outside of our navigation. And if we inspect this navigation, we see that we do have a padding on the x-axis of 22 pixels. So one thing that's really hard if you don't have design is to come up with a correct spacing scale, because it's now not that easy to see throughout the website what type of spacing scale they're using. So I'm actually gonna stick with Tailwind's default spacing scale here, which means sometimes we have to use a little bit different type of spacing, but we're gonna live with that for now in the sake of consistency and because I don't want to spend 2 hours finding out what our spacing scale is. So that means that we're actually gonna use the padding of 6, I think, which is 24. Yeah, which is 24 pixels. So we're gonna use that on the x-axis. And then we're also gonna add text white on here. And then I now notice that the styles are actually not applied. And that is because in our config, we also need to set the content path still. So let's quickly do that as well. Or let Copilot do it for us, as you can see here. So this way, Tailwind knows where to look for the classes. And now you should be able to see a black background. And that's correct. And then if we look at the design again, you see that it is actually pretty much 2 levels. So that means that we also need to add the main navigation in there still. But before we start doing that, we also need to look at what the behavior is. Because if I scroll now, you see that the top navigation goes away, but then the Apple TV Plus logo, it becomes sticky. So that means that in order to make this sticky, we can't make this part of the exact same parent. Or said otherwise, we can't put this Apple TV Plus inside of the header component. I will show you in a second why that is. But first, we need to go back to that header component, and then we're gonna add a React fragment on here. Then I'm gonna take this Apple TV Plus, and we're actually gonna make a regular div where we put the Apple TV Plus, and then on here, let's add a Apple emoji. Oh, we can even use the Apple logo, maybe not in this font. Let's see. It is working. Nice. Okay. Of course, if we really want to do this properly, we should make this an anchor that goes back to the homepage. And of course, this logo only is not accessible to screen readers. So let's add a span on here with a class name of screen reader only, where we're going to add apple.com maybe. Or maybe even instead of apple.com, you could also say back to homepage. That would be a lot more logical, I guess, because this way, if a visually impaired user would focus this anchor, it would read out back to a homepage. And that then makes a lot of sense. And this as our only class name, make sure that it's not visible to people who are not visually impaired and only read out to screen readers. So next, we also need to copy our class name from the header component and add that onto the other div as well. So both of them have a black background. And then the main navigation also has some anchors in there, of course, and even a mega menu, all of these things. I'm actually not gonna build that because otherwise we would be working 1 hour on the main navigation, maybe even longer. And I really wanna work on all of these other sections because I think that's where the most fun is at. So that means that we're gonna give this main header some padding. So that means we're gonna give this main header component a fixed height or a minimum height. So at least there's a little bit more breathing room. So for that, if you inspect it, you see that it has a height of 44 pixels. So let's go back to our component and let's give it a min height of, let's see if we can get close to 44. Min height of 11 is 44 pixels, yes. And then we're also going to make this display flex and add item center on there, so everything will be centered. And if you then inspect that, you see that we have this fixed height or min height header element, and the logo is centered in the middle. Then also, if you would inspect this anchor, you will see that it's now very, very small. So it would actually be a lot better to also make sure that all of these anchors have the exact same height, and also probably have some padding on the x-axis as well, so you have a little bit of a bigger hit target. So let's do that by adding a class name on there as well. And then we're gonna add the height of 11. And then we're also gonna need to make this display flex and give it item center. So now you see that the anchor extends the full height. The only thing we still need to do is also give this a padding, for example, of 6. So you see now that there is a lot bigger of a hit target because of the padding. So especially on mobile, it's now a lot easier to click this thing. Because not only does the anchor trigger the click, but also the padding area around it. The only thing you see now is that everything is inset, of course, towards that padding. So one simple solution against this would be to give a negative margin left of 6. And now everything is pulled to the left again, and you still have that hit target that now extends just a little bit to the left. So for that second navigation, we're also going to add a min height of 11, make it flex, and add item center on there. And before we now continue with adding the right font size and things like that, I first want to make that sticky behavior because I also want to have a little bit of fun and not only do boring stuff like setting font sizes. So what happens right now is if you scroll, we can't scroll because there's no room to scroll. So that's why I added in all of these spacer components. So let's just say we add a class name on of our hero and we just say height, 300 viewport height. So this way we have something to scroll. And if you would scroll now, everything will just disappear. So how can we fix that and make sure that the header element will stay at the top? Well, nowadays with CSS, it is actually pretty simple. We can simply add position sticky on here and give this a top of 0. And if we would do that, you see that by default, everything is normal. But as soon as you start scrolling, you see that everything sticks to the top. And again, that is exactly what we want. And with only these two CSS properties, we were now able to achieve that. And then to get back to what I was explaining earlier, if you would add this div inside of the header component, then of course we have display flex now. So let's say we make this flex call, so it is at least underneath each other. If you would scroll now, you see that both would disappear. And why is that? That is all because position sticky will be sticky towards its first parent that it encounters, and then it will be sticky for as long as possible. So in this case, it will become sticky, but it also will become unsticky right after because there is no room inside of its parent, which is that header component, to keep sticky within. So that means we need to go back and take it outside of the header component again. And now the first parent is the full page. So that's why it's sticky right until the very bottom of the page. Also, let's remove that flex column again, so everything is correct. The next thing I also want to do now is make sure that our content is centered in the middle. Because if we would go back to the Apple example and we would zoom out, then you will see that once we're beyond a certain breakpoint, the content just gets centered in the middle. And for that, I always like to use some sort of container component instead of Tailwind's default container class name, but that's just a preference and something I'm used to and like to work with. So that's actually what we're going to do here as well. So let's open up our sidebar and then we go back to our components directory, and then we're going to add a container.tsx. In there, we're going to export const container. And this container takes in some props. The props are children, which is a React node, which we can take from the props then. And then in this case, it will simply return a div with the children in there. And then we're going to add a class name on top of here, where we say margin 0 auto. And then we give it a max width of, let's take 1200 pixels for now. And then we're also going to use that padding x of 6 on the x-axis. So this way, we can now take this container component and then it will center everything in the middle. So let's go back to our header component and wrap the full content inside of our container component. Then we need to import that. And we do the exact same in the other header element. That also means that we need to take our display flex and add that on side of our container. Flex and item center. And that also, of course, means that we need to go into our container component and make sure that it accepts a class name. So the other prop is a class name, which is optional and a string. We're going to add that to our destructured variables as well. And then we're going to add that to our class name. For that, I always like to use the Tailwind merge package. That Tailwind merge package makes sure that if you set, for example, 2 paddings and you set a padding as a class name, that always will have preference over the padding that we would have specified on here already. Because otherwise you're dependent on the order it is loaded in Tailwind's bundle, and it could very well be that the class name you add is earlier in the bundle than your other class name that's already on here, and then it simply wouldn't work. Tailwind merge makes sure that it always works. So let's kill the dev server, and then we're gonna pm add Tailwind merge. And then we're gonna start the dev server again. And then in here, we're gonna import tw merge from Tailwind merge. And we're gonna add that function around our class name. And then as a second argument, we're gonna pass in our own custom class names. And this will then make sure, like I said, that both of them are merged. So if we now go back to our header component, we see that the class name is now an accepted prop, and we can actually do the same for the other one. Class name is display flex and item center. Oh, and what we also need to add, by the way, is the min height to our container instead of the wrapper. And also we can remove the padding from the x-axis now because that is set on our container. And if we do that, we should still see the exact same, which is correct. And if we now zoom out, everything becomes centered just like apples. Okay, let's go back still and also make sure that we extracted the right max width. Or extracted, we still need to get it because I just took a random number. Let's see, it's probably this wrapper component. And they actually have a max width of 980 pixels. So let's just go back to our container and just hard code that for now. As soon as we're gonna need that in different places as well, we might turn it into a variable that we can reuse. But as long as there is only one place where we use it, why not just put it in hard coded? Saves us some thinking, right? So that means that our component is now centered. And then we actually can go back to our app, and we could pretty much add that around all of our other components as well, because I guess they should be centered too. So why not already do that? So as you see, I tend to jump around just a little bit between the different types of things that I'm working on. As long as you don't do too much at the same time, and especially once you're setting up a project, I don't think there is anything wrong with doing that, and it just makes things a little bit fun, right? So if we go back, we now see that everything is centered and has the padding on it. That's great. So the next step is also make sure that we're gonna add the correct font sizes and maybe already start adding a button component. Because as soon as we've done that, it's almost time to start working on the hero animation. So let's start first by adding in that button component so we can already add that in. And from there, we can start working on the different type of font sizes. And for that button, we will need to add a button component in here. Of course, looking at the design, you see that there's different kinds of buttons and multiple buttons throughout the page, which means that we pretty much need to make them a component right away instead of doing that later. So let's open up our sidebar again. We go to components and we're gonna add a button.tsx. On there, we're again gonna export const button. And that for now will return a button. Click me. This button variable we can then import inside of our header. Of course, the button is now complaining because I wrote click me inside of there and it actually should accept children properties. So let's go back to that button and fix it right away, because why not? Type props, gives us children, and then a React node. Class name is suggested by Copilot, but we're actually gonna remove that for now. And then we're gonna go to our button, destructure children, and assign the TypeScript type. And then instead of click me, we're actually gonna add the children in there. And once that's done, the button is not complaining anymore, and we should see that we at least are rendering something. Yes, we're rendering test. That's cool. So in order to spread out these two different types of buttons, I'm actually gonna wrap my text inside of a paragraph. because now we have two different types of elements, which means that we can use the justify between clause, which adds justify content space between, and that means that both of them are pulled to the opposite sides. So now let's go back to our button and add a class name on there. Let's say background white, and then text black. So this way we're using the text black color for our button and add a background color on there. I also noticed that it should be rounded full because it had full rounded borders, or rounded corners, I mean, of course. And then we also noticed that there's probably some sort of padding on there, which is 10 on the x-axis and 3 on the y. So for that, we're going to use px of 3 and py of 1. That gives us a padding on the y-axis of 4 and on the x-axis of 12, which is slightly different. But again, because we're using Tailwind's default spacing scheme, that's what we're going to live with for now. And then you already see that we have a button that looks just a little bit better. However, now we also need to add some different type of sizes, because if you look, you see that we have a very small button, kind of a medium button, as well as on top here, a large button. So let's add another prop to the button where we're going to say size. Well, Copilot is suggesting small, medium, large, which kind of makes sense, I guess. So let's just go with that. And then we're going to destructure that size property. And we're actually going to set a default as medium. So this way, if you don't pass in the size parameter because it's optional here, then we're going to, by default, set it to medium. So now the next step is, based on this size variable, we need to use different types of Tailwind class names. And as soon as your components start to become a little bit more complex, you might want to opt for a library like class variance authority, for example. I made a video about that as well, which I will link up here. But I think for this button, we're now going to stick with simply doing it ourselves because there isn't a lot of different types of logic in here yet. And if this will be the only component that we would use it for, then I don't see the use to add this library at this moment. But again, once a button becomes more complicated, we definitely should do that. But for now, let's just say const class names or size class names. There will be an object. Thank you very much, Copilot, where we're going to add the different types of sizes. And then based on that, we're actually going to use different font sizes and probably different paddings. So that means that we now have these different class names, and we can use Tailwind merge again to add these class names on here. So let's import Tailwind merge from Tailwind merge. And then we're going to remove the default padding and then take our size class names. And then we're going to add size in there. And this way we take the right class names from the size and we simply add that to our button. And by doing that, we all of a sudden have a button that has different sizes. So if we were to go back to our header, we can now add size equals small on here. And now I see that I don't even really like what Copilot did, because size SM, it's fine, but it reads so much easier to just read small, medium, and large, I think. And since there's auto-completion anyway, let's just go back and change this to small, this to medium, and this to large. Then we go back to our header, and then we're going to change that to small. I think this is so much more logical than using these abbreviations. But with that, we should see that we now have a smaller button. That's correct. Only thing we still need to do is we need to take the different types of font sizes. So let's see, that's 12 pixels. Let me just write that down for now. This should be 12 pixels. Then we have the medium button, which is this one, that has a font size of 14 pixels. And then we have our large button, which has a font size of 17 pixels. Now, the reason I wrote that down as comment is because we're still using Tailwind's default font sizes. And I think now we are playing around with the different type of text sizes. It is actually pretty much time to start adding in our own font sizes. So let's just take these different font sizes already and go to our theme. And we're going to add font size on there. Then it seems like you saw in the button, we need 12, 14, and 17. And 17. And let's see what different types of font sizes we're still able to find. 21, 72, 19. 40. 19, we already got that. 28. 24. So it seems like with that, we got all the different types of font sizes that Apple uses. And because we now have that, we can pretty much define our own font scale instead of using Tailwind's default. So let's say we have our extra small, which if we use REM, which you should be 0.75 REM because our root node is 16 pixels. And if you want to know more about REM, also check this video up here. Then we have our small, which is 14. Then we get our base, which is 17 divided by 16 REM. And then we get large, which is 19 divided by 16 REM. I also always like to add the pixel values on there, so it's just a little bit easier to remember what the different values are. Or maybe we could even do it like this. And then we have extra large, 21 divided by 16, 2XL, 1.5 REM, yes, and then we get 3XL, then we get 5XL, and with that we have our own custom font scale, and it seems like we have all the different fonts that Apple is using. So let's go back to our button, and now we can start using them. We set 12 pixels, which indeed is our text extra small, 14 is small, and 17, I believe, is our base. Yep. And with that, we now have all of the correct font sizes as well, and it is only a matter of making sure that we also add the right paddings on there. So let's take a brief look and see what the types of padding were. For small, it's 10 and 3. Well, it depends. We could, of course, take the 8 or take the 12, because both of them are not correct. Let's just stick with the 8 indeed, because let's see what medium has as a padding. 22 and 12. So that means that we're going to take 5 and padding Y as 3. And for the large, 31 and 18 means that we're going to take padding X of 8. And on the Y-axis, 18 divided by 4 is 4.5. So let's take 5. Now let's go with 4. And then we all of a sudden have different types of buttons in different types of sizes. So if we would go back to our hero component, for example, we can also add a button component in there and make it the large button by adding size equals to large. And then it is white, but you clearly see that the text size is a lot larger than the small button. And now we have the font sizes. We can also take a look at this Apple TV text and see what the text size is for that. It's 21 pixels, and 21 pixels matches to our text extra large. So let's go to the header and also add a class name on there with text extra large. And it probably, yeah, it also has a font weight of 600. So let's also add font medium on there, which is 500. Semi-bold is 600. Yeah. And with that, it is also time to make sure that we add the right font size on there, which for Apple, of course, is San Francisco Pro Display. So for that, we go back to the config again, go to font family and add a sans property on there, where we can add San Francisco Pro Display. Well, right now I didn't load any custom font, simply because on my Mac it's there, but of course that's a very bad reason. But I don't think I'm gonna add that in this video, because there's many videos where you can see how you can add custom fonts, and this video probably will already be more than long enough. So if we switch back now, we at least should have a correct Apple font. And when the only thing missing still is that the Apple logo is actually a little bit too small. So let's see if we can find the size that they're actually using for this. Although we are using an emoji and they're using SVG, which is 14 pixels in width. So let's see if we can try to replicate that by setting a little bit larger font size on here. Font size 14 pixels, 18 pixels, Yeah, I guess this kind of makes sense. Let's just make it 20 pixels or go with the 21 pixels because looking at our config, we can make it text extra large then. And look at that. We just got ourselves a partial header component. Hooray. But I mean, we laid a pretty important foundation. We set up things like colors, buttons, font sizes. All of these things are already in there. So that means that from now on, I guess we will start picking up speed. So let's start picking up speed then and stop talking. Okay, thank you. So I think we will be leaving the header alone for a little bit and start focusing on the hero component. Because with that, we can finally start seeing something nice happen on a page and also start working on some animations. So again, my starting point always is to scaffold out what I see and then start to add some styles to it. So looking at the design again, we see that we have an image in the background, or it's actually a video. If I refresh, it will play. Then we have a title, a button, and a subtext, watch on the TV app. So let's go back and we go into our app component. And actually the moment right now is here to start breaking out our hero component into a custom component. So let's go back and then we're going to create a new component. And maybe, especially if you would be creating something bigger, of course, you will probably create a directory called sections maybe, or homepage sections, something like that. So you can have everything in one place. Or maybe if you're using Next.js or in Vite, it could work as well. You can co-locate those components close to the page as well. For this example, I'm going to create a folder called section. And in there, we're going to add hero.tsx. Export const hero. And then we're going to go back to our app and we copy what we had there. We return that from our render function. And then we still need to import container as well as button. And then in here, we can add our hero component. So that way we can now focus on our hero component and we're not distracted by anything else. So first, let's start scaffolding out what you see in there. So we already have the button. Then I wrote here hero component. We don't need that anymore, but there is like a title that's actually in here. All Apple originals only on Apple TV+. So let's add maybe even an H1 in here because this is the most important title on the page. And if you inspect it, you will actually see that Apple hit a different kind of H1 on the page and made this one an H2. We're going to stick with H1 because only looking at a design, it would seem that this is the H1. So let's create a H1 on here. And then we're going to add all Apple originals only on Apple TV+. And maybe we even want to add a line break on there so it breaks at exactly that place, but we'll see if that's useful or not once we go towards mobile. Then we have this button and then we have the subtext, watch on the TV app. Let's just make that a paragraph, watch on the TV app. And then let's see if this TV is actually an icon. Yeah, it kind of is, but it's actually an SVG that they load remotely. And I'm not sure if this has any copyright. Oh, it's a PNG, by the way. But I'm not sure if it has a copyright. So let's just stick with an emoji again for now. So let's just take this one and we're going to add TV on here. Watch on the TV app. Okay. But that means that we at least have the scaffolding done, and now it's time to do some styling. The very first thing you notice is that if you scroll, you see that everything seems to fade out. And that means that we probably have to fade to black. So I think it makes most sense if we add a black background to this hero component as well. So on here, we're going to add background, because that's our black background color. So that way you already see this, which is not too beautiful. So that also means that we need to add text white on there, so we at least can read again what we're doing. And now for the first time, we can also see our very large button. Nice. Okay, and then we're gonna go towards our main text. It has a font size of 72 pixels, and 72 pixels, looking at our Tailwind config again, is 5 extra large. So let's go here, class name, text 5 extra large. And again, also here, there might be a moment where it's more logical to create a component for our headings instead of repeating different class names. Because if we're gonna add, for example, a font weight on there, you don't want that to be different across your whole app. So then a component might make sense. So just keep that in mind while we're typing, that maybe we need to refactor that pretty soon. So the text 5 extra large, and then it has a font weight of bold. So font bold, which is a weight of 700. And also for the first time now, it becomes relevant to also look at the line height, I think. So for this specific text, they added a line height of 76, which is slightly larger than the 72 pixels. So I always like to use floating points for line height. So that means that 76 divided by 72 is 1.05. So let's copy that. And we can go back to the Tailwind config. And instead of adding a string on there, we're simply able to add an array that actually has 2 values. And in there, we are able to add a different value, which is actually the value that will be used for the line height. So if you take a font size of 5 extra large, it will now automatically apply the same line height as well. So if we now look, we should see that the font size is set 4.5, and we also have the line height we specified. That's great. Now the same thing for the watch on Apple TV. And they made this a little bit annoying that it's hard to inspect it. So there you see the line height is 23, font size 19. So let's go to the 19, and then we do 23 divided by 19 is 1.21. So now that also has the correct line height. And you also notice that it probably has a font size. Yeah, it's semi-bold. So we're gonna add class name, font semi-bold. And that pretty much adds most of the styles in there. Now it's time to add some margin, but before we start doing that, I think we should add that image to the background as well. So for these images, I also don't want to use any Apple images because I don't know about the copyright on them. I guess Apple could get mad at me. So I found some Unsplash images, which I link in the README as well as a thank you. But let's add those in there. So let's add a new directory public, and then I paste in my posters. These are all from Unsplash, and I will make sure to link them in the README as well. But then we have some images that we can use. So let's go back to our hero, and then we're gonna add an image tag on there, where we're gonna add /poster/napoleon.webp /posters, of course, and then we have a nice image. But of course, that image should be in the background. So we can make this a background image, but then fading them out would be a little bit harder. So I think keeping them as an image so we can fade out that image is a little bit easier. However, if we go back to the Apple TV again, you see that if you scroll, the text goes out of view. And if you keep on scrolling, it even fades out and the image is gone. So I think we need to do some position absolute and maybe even position sticky magic here. So let's wrap our image inside of a div, and then we're gonna make our hero position relative. And our image wrapper, we're gonna give it position absolute, top 0, left 0, and width full. So now you see that our image is position absolute, and the text is actually lying right underneath it. So let's go to our container, give it a position relative and a z-index of 10, and all of a sudden the text is on top of it again. Now let's make sure that the text is actually pushed down a little bit. And if you look at, again, Apple's example, you see that the text is actually pretty much at the end of the viewport. So what I want to suggest is we're actually going to make this container have a min height of screen, and we're actually not going to use screen, because if we would use screen, you would notice on Safari mobile, for example, that actually a part is outside of the view. Check this video up here if you want to know more about that. But there is actually a new property that we can use for that will prevent this. So instead of using 100 viewport height, you can actually use 100 smallest viewport height. And that actually solves this issue. Check this video up here if you want to know more about that as well. But this will make sure that everything sticks to the bottom of the screen, but won't go outside of the visible portion if you're, for example, on a mobile device. So now if we go back to our version, still nothing happened, except that we now have this div that actually is the height of the screen. And that height we can then utilize to push everything inside of it down to the end of the container. So let's just make sure we use display flags and then make the flags column, and then we add justify end. This way everything is pushed down. However, what you also see is that everything is just outside of the viewport, and that is because, of course, we still have that sticky header. So now comes the very first moment where it might make sense to do a very small refactor, because what we actually need to know is what the height is of the header, because we have to subtract that from the height, the smallest viewport height unit that we used a minute ago. So I think it would be wise to go into our style sheet, and then we're going to add layer base, where we're going to add a root property. And in there, I think it would be a good idea to add a variable for our header size. So if we go back to our header for a second, you see that we used height 11, which was 44 pixels. So let's just say header height equals 44 pixels, or probably header row height, and then header height will be calc var header row height times 2. So this way we can go back into our header, and instead of using the 11, we can use header row height as a value. So now we're just using that CSS variable. And then we can also go back into our hero, and instead of using the 100 viewport height or 100 smallest viewport height, we could do a few things. We could add a calc in here, which might start to become a little bit ugly. So it could also be interesting to go back to our style sheet and also add in a hero height, where we say calc, yeah, but then 100 smallest viewport height, and then we subtract the header height. So this way we can take our hero height, go back to the hero component, and add it in here like this. So this way we are now using the header height to subtract from the screen height. So this way, if we go back, you will see that everything fits in view. And if you start all scrolling, then of course everything moves out of the way except the header. However, it's now not visible anymore because, as you can see, our hero scrolls over it. So that means that we need to go back to the header component and add a Z20 on here. So it's actually over top of our hero. And then all of a sudden we have this hero. And look at that. Now at least everything fits in view, but now it's up to us to make it look just a little bit better. So let's go back to our hero. What we did is we added justify end, which pushed everything down. However, what Flexbox also does is everything will become full width. So we can change that by adding items start, and now everything is moved to the left again and is not extended by the full width. So that, I think, is already a good change. Then of course what you also see is there's a different margin. So let's see if we can find any useful values that we want to use for this. So there is a margin top of 71. So 71 divided by 4, you can use 16. So we can give our button a class name, 16. And then you already notice that we don't support a class name on the button yet. So that means we go back to our button, add a class name on there, which is optional string. And then we're going to take that class name and add that to our Tailwind merge and to the destructuring of the props. And now the class name here is happy and it has applied a button. Then also we need to see what the margin is underneath the title. Oh, it's actually 2, I see. They added a 25 margin as well as a 13. So that makes 38. So let's make that a margin bottom of 10 then, which is about the same value. And then you notice that Apple likes to use a margin top for all of their elements. I think it's kind of a preference, but I always like to use margin bottom to push everything down instead of the other way around. But I guess it's just a matter of preference. However, if we go back now, we already see that things fit a little bit better on the screen. However, I also noticed that the text, of course, is really sticking at the bottom. And of course, Apple's version does not do that. They probably also have some margin or padding at the bottom. Yeah, it's 28 pixels from the bottom. So I actually want to add a padding bottom of 7 on here. 7 is 28 pixels, yeah. So this way our container now has a padding bottom and you see that everything then moves up just a little bit. And look at that. We already have a quite neat looking hero section. Oh, one thing we of course left in is test, which looks so stupid. So let's see, it should be stream now. So let's go back to our header, remove the stupid test and make it stream now. Yeah, so much better. And now the next thing we have to do is make sure that actually the image stays in place if we start scrolling. So let's see how we can do that, because right now everything will just move out of view. And this brings us back to our hero component and brings us back to where I added the position absolute. Because why did I do that? So in this case, I wanted to use an image. Firstly, because it's easier to animate the opacity then. And secondly, also because I think these images are relevant for users and for Google and things like that. They're not like illustrative, but they're rather part of the content. So that is why I think having the image as an image tag instead of a background image kind of makes sense here. But back to that position absolute. What we can do now by making this position absolute is, for example, I could make this div height 200 viewport height. And let's make it background red for a second. Then you see that the red portion now extends beyond the portion where the container is actually at. And that is because this element now has a height of 200 viewport height. So that also means that if we would make this image position sticky, it would stay at the top of the page for as long as this element is on the page, and it can be sticky to it. So let's try and see what that does. Let's add a class name on there, make it sticky, top 0, and then we start scrolling. And then you already see that the image stays sticky while the text scrolls away. And that is exactly what we want. However, one other thing you also might notice is that the image does not extend the full height. And especially if we start scrolling, you see that there's a moment it takes before it gets sticky, and then there's even more red background right underneath it. So there's two things we have to change for this. The first one all has to do with the image. We need to make sure that the image is actually the height of the screen. And in this case, we're not going to use the smallest viewport height, because if you would scroll away on a mobile device, you would still see like an empty space at the bottom. And in this case, we want the image to extend the full height always, not only when the address bar is visible. So in this case, we're going to give the image a height of screen. So that might mean that if the toolbar is visible on mobile browsers, that you won't see a part of the image, but since it's also for illustrative purposes, I think that's fine. But one other thing we also need to do, because if we take a look at the image now, you see that it gets stretched, is we need to add object cover on there as well. So this will create object fit cover, and that will make sure that the image is not stretched, but that it simply fills the available space, and what does not fit is cropped off. But now if you start scrolling, you still see we have this moment before the element becomes sticky. And that is because our div is actually put the size of our header down on the page. So it has the room to scroll once the header element scrolls out of view. So I think the best way to fix this is not give our hero image a top 0, but actually give it a negative margin that is equal to the height of the header. Because that way we put it again back at the top of the page and there's no room for it to scroll. So for that, we can use the variable that we created before. So we can use negative top, and then we can use header height as a variable. Oh, and I added it to the sticky position of the image, which is actually not correct because it should be sticky at the top of the div. But we should go to our wrapper div, which is position absolute, because that's the div that we can pull up. Position sticky, you can't really pull up outside of its parent. So there we have to add our negative top and then header height. And if we then go back, we should see that the image always remains in place. And that is because there is no room for the absolute div to scroll up to. And that means that the image will always be sticky at the top of the viewport. Until we scroll far enough and we've reached the end of our 200 viewport height div, then the image will also scroll out of view. And this way, because we now also have that 200 viewport height, we are able to control for how long or for which scroll distance the image will be sticky. And that's something that we can in a second tweak to our advantage to tailor the animation to our liking. So while we're at it, let's also remove that red background because we don't need it now. And then we're also going to change this large button to also be stream now, like it used to be. Stream now. And then one thing I still want to check is if there is some sort of overlay over this image. And as far as I can see right now, there doesn't seem to be any sort of shadow or something that's overlaying the video. So the text would be better readable. So I think we're also going to skip that for now and just go ahead by adding the animations because, again, that's a little bit more fun, right? So as for the animation, what should happen is if the user starts scrolling, you see that the text immediately fades out. Then the image is visible or the video is visible for a short while. And then the other USBs come into view while at the same time the image or video starts fading out. So let's see how we can recreate that. What I want to use in this project for animations is Framer Motion. So let's first go ahead and install Framer Motion. We're going to install that by running pm add Framer Motion. And then we can use Framer Motion. So for the hero, we can use the use scroll hook by Framer Motion. So let's import that right away. Import use scroll from Framer Motion. And then we're going to go into our hero component, and we need to create two things. First, we're going to create const video container ref. So that is a ref to the element where our video, or in our case, the image is in. So there will be a ref that we put on this div. Then we're gonna import the use ref from React. Its initial value is null and it is an HTML div element. And then we're gonna copy this ref and set that ref on our element. Because based on this ref, we can now use the use scroll hook. That use scroll hook works as following. We can use scroll as a function, and in there we can pass a target. By passing in this target, we're able to measure how far this element has been in view. So this will return a variable, which is an object, and that object contains a property scroll y progress. And in that scroll y progress, we get a number between 1 and 0 of how far the element has been scrolled into view. Then as a second argument, we're also able to pass in the offset, where we can enter the amount of visibility that we're interested in. Or said otherwise, do we want the element to be at the bottom of the view when it starts triggering or at the top of the viewport? This offset property is a little bit confusing to me if you'd ask me, but if you're interested in learning more, absolutely check out my course on Framer Motion as well, because there I go more into depth in these kind of things. However, because we now have this scroll y progress, we are able to turn this number into an opacity that we can then use to fade out the video. And for that, we can use another hook from Framer Motion. That hook will be use transform, and then we can create a variable const opacity equals use transform, where we input our scroll y progress as the input value. And then we're going to pass in two arrays. And these arrays are the first one, the amount of distance scroll that we're interested in. So we want to animate from 0 to 0.7, and we don't want to change anything. It should stay opacity 1, and then until the end, it should fade out. So if we convert that into opacity values, then at 0%, it should be opacity 1. At 70%, it should stay opacity 1. And then at 100%, it should be opacity 0. And by that, we created an opacity value that will change over time based on how far the user has scrolled. So if we now take this opacity, then we need to turn our div into a motion.div. And then we have to import motion from Framer Motion as well. But by doing that, we can now pass in a style tag where we set the opacity of the video. And this style tag is kind of a special Framer Motion style tag. Also, I teach more about that in my course, but just know that this is not like a regular inline style, but that Framer Motion is gonna add some magic to this here as well. So let's see if we now start scrolling, if we see the element fade out. And that's true. And with that fade out, we now have kind of the transition into the next section where all of these USBs would fade in. But before we can do that, we also need to fade out the text, just like you would see in Apple's example as well. So let's go back to our code. And what we need to do for that is we need to have one div, I think. And for that, I think it's valuable if we add our content into a single div. So we only need to fade out one element instead of 3, which saves us just a little bit of code, or at least repetition. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap our full content inside a motion.div. And now we can use this motion.div to fade it out. And instead of creating another use scroll listener for this specific text, I actually want to use the inline props that Framer Motion supplies. So let's start by adding in a variance prop on here. And in there, we're gonna add hidden, which is opacity 0 and a y of 20, and visible, which is opacity 1 and a y of 0. And then we can use the while in view prop, where we can set our current animation to be visible. So this way, now Framer Motion will automatically add all of the scroll listeners and will do everything for us, and we don't need to do anything. And we can configure that while in view by adding another viewport prop. And in there, we can set an amount. So if we set the amount to 1, we require the element to be 100% visible. And if there is only a small portion out of view, it will start fading out. However, before that starts to work, we also need to tell Framer Motion what should happen if it is exiting the view. And for that, we're going to add the exit prop. And we're going to tell Framer Motion that it then should apply the hidden animation variant. And finally, we also need to add the animate prop, which is also equal to our hidden state. And if we do that, and we're going to then, for example, change our viewport to 0.9, because otherwise there's like this threshold where it's exactly in view, but also exactly not. And then it might trigger back and forth between fading in, fading out, fading in, fading out. So if we do that and we start scrolling, you should see that now the text fades out. However, what you see in Apple's example is that if you only scroll just a little bit, the content already fades out. So that means that instead of targeting our text, which will only become out of view once it's at the top, we should actually not use our flex end like we did in our container, where we push this full div down. We actually want this div to simply extend the full height. So for that, we can remove the display flex that we added earlier. And then we can add that to our new motion div. Because this way, the motion div will put all its content inside of it down, but the div itself will still be the full height. Or at least it would be the full height if we also gave it a height full. But that does also mean that because we're using Flexbox, that we need to change the min height to a height of the hero height, because otherwise the Flexbox child won't extend the full height, even though we added height full. So let's remove that and make it a fixed height. And I guess for the hero, that should be fine, because we really want to be in control of our hero and we want to make sure that the text always fits. So a min height in this case would be too much of a safety precaution, I guess. But if you do that, you see that our height full div now extends the full height. And as soon as you start scrolling, it will already fade out, or at least it will fade out a lot earlier. And the timing when it fades out is all controlled by the amount that we have set. So we can of course make this 1 again or make it 98. So it would trigger a lot earlier, because in Apple's example, it also triggers quite quickly. And this way now the element fades out rather fast. But I also noticed that I added a movement on the y-axis, but Apple's original doesn't do that at all. So let's just remove the y. So we only have the opacity fade. And then in this case, we have the exact same situation where if it would be a video, you would see the video, and as soon as you keep on scrolling, then the element will fade out. And that pretty much sums up our hero component. The only thing missing now still is responsive behavior. But before we start going into that, I actually first want to work on the next section, and then we do responsive for both of them at the same time. So going back to Apple's example again, the next section would be where all of these texts or USPs start to scroll over top of the video. And then they also fade in and move up one by one. So let's go back to our app component and start adding this next section. Let me close everything we don't need for now, and then we go back to our app component, and then we're gonna create this USB section. So let's simply copy all of this, go into components section, and then we're gonna add USPs.tsx, export const USPs. That will contain this div for now. Then we're gonna import our container and go back to our page, and we're gonna add the USPs in there. And then for now, I guess we don't need this wrapper div anymore because we already have the container. And on that container, we're gonna add a text of white, and we're gonna add a text of 3 extra large, which should be the correct font size for all of these USPs. Now, let's already go ahead and put out some scaffolding again. So we're just gonna copy these texts in there and add them in as paragraphs. So let's see what that already looks like. If we now scroll, we see that our text is actually at the very bottom and is of course white. And we actually need to have this text on a black background as well. And also, probably that should be a shared background between both of these elements, because in a second, the text should be overflowing our hero. So let's go back and go into our app component. And it means that we're gonna wrap both of these two components inside a single div with a background color. So we're gonna add a div. Then we're gonna add a class name of background, which is our background color. And then we already see that the text at least is visible. And now what we still need to do is, in the beginning, we added a fixed height of 300 viewport height to our hero section, but it was only so we had some distance to scroll. So now, of course, we need to go back into our hero component and make sure that we remove that height of 200 viewport height. And if you do that, and we scroll up, you see that like all of the different text already starts to overlay our image. And the reason it is overlaying is because our hero itself has the height of the screen, but the image is then positioned sticky for 200 viewport height. Because if we look one more time, we see that we created this div where the image is positioned absolute, and that has a height of 200 viewport height. So it's way longer sticky than actually the size of the hero itself is. And that is the reason why we start to see this overlapping. So now let's use that to our advantage and go back into our USPs and start making that section a little bit bigger so you don't see everything overlapping the hero. So the first thing I notice is that, of course, the text is way too small. So let's go back into our Apple's example and let's see what type of font size they use. That is 40 pixels. And 40 pixels, if we go to our Tailwind config, matches to 4XL. And you also see the text is probably bold. So we're also going to add font bold on here. And I'm actually setting that on the container, so I don't need to repeat it for all the different paragraphs, and they will simply inherit these font settings. That just saves some repetition. Then also there's this gap, of course, between the two different items. And there is a margin of 50, so we can add a margin of 12 to that. And with Tailwind, we can use a spacing class, space Y of 12, for example, which makes sure that there's a spacing of 12 between all of the different children. And that already makes it a little bit better, but not completely yet, of course. One thing we're still lacking is a proper line height, which I guess we didn't set yet for this font size. So let's see, the font size is 40 and the line height is 44, which turns into 1.1, I think. Yes. So let's go back to the Tailwind config. And indeed, it's not set. So turn this into an array. And then we're going to make it 1.1. And what you also notice is that this text is actually a lot smaller than the rest of the text. So let's see, there's probably a different max width on this container. And that is 692 pixels. So for that, we're able to go into our USPs and we can simply add another class name on our container. Because in this case, it seems like it's only a single instance where they change the size of the container. So I'm not going to make our container have a small and large variant yet. Unless I notice in a second that we're going to need it in multiple places, then we simply need to refactor this a little bit. But for now, we're going to add a max width of 692 pixels as an inline style here, or inline style, a Tailwind arbitrary value. And then you already see that the text is centered a lot more. Now I guess everything is also still very tightly, so we probably need to add some padding to that as well. So let's for now, we're going to add a padding on the y-axis of 36, just to pick any random number now to give us a little bit more breathing room. But what you already start seeing now is that if you scroll, the element is fading out, and once the text is fully on the screen, the full element is gone. So this already starts to look similar to the approach Apple took. The only thing we still need to do is make sure that we fade in the items. And also, I noticed that we have a small z-index issue going on. Because the reason we're seeing this text now is because the video or the image on top is actually fading out. It is not the text that is fading in. And that is because our position absolute element is actually overlying the rest of the content. So a simple fix for that is to actually give our USP container a higher z-index than our absolute image. And our absolute image actually has a z-index of 1, which is the default, but because it's positioned absolute, it will still lie over top of any other elements with the same z-index. So for that, we're going to turn our USPs container into a z-index of 10. And that means that we also need to add a position relative to it to make that z-index work. And then you see that the text is always fully visible. Now we only need to add in that fade in logic. And for that fade in logic, I think it would be wise if we create a reusable component. Because if you look at the other section, there's also another section that fades in. And this way we're able to reuse that component. So let's go into our components and create a new file called fadein.tsx. And I'm thinking that this component simply accepts children, and it will then add a wrapper div around it that will fade it in when it's in view. So that means we need to define our type for props, which takes in children. Whoa, thank you, Copilot. I don't need all of that. It only takes in some children, and that's it for now, I think. So that means that we take the children here from the props. And then in here, we can return a motion.div with the children as its contents. Of course, we need to import motion from framer motion. And then we go back to our USPs component and we will wrap each paragraph inside that fade in tag. So as you can see now, we have this kind of component that we can use to make an element fade in on scroll. And that way we can use it everywhere and we don't need to do anything special to make that work. Or at least if we made the component, because right now the component is only a div and doesn't do anything yet. So that also means if we go back to our code, that you see that nothing is happening yet. However, it's now actually pretty simple to start adding in that fade in animation. Because like we've used before, we can use the props on the motion component to pretty much do anything we want. We can say initial, it is opacity 0, and it has a Y of 20. And then while in view, it becomes opacity 1 and Y 0. And that's pretty much the only thing we need to do to have that basic fade in work. And because we share the component again, it just works everywhere now. So let's see, if we refresh, then you see that it is actually fading in, but it's happening so fast at the end of the viewport that, I mean, you might even miss it. And for that, we can of course also still control when it would start fading in. And the property we can use for that is called viewport. And inside that viewport, we can set a margin, and that margin tells the browser when it should trigger the intersection observer. And the way this works is kind of like a regular margin. You have top, right, bottom, left as values, and you can set a specific value for that. So we could, for example, say 100% as our top value, which means that it is 100% beyond the top. So that actually means we never see it fade out in the top, which pretty much is what we want, because looking at Apple's example, you will see that, or you will not see it fade out. Then on the x-axis, we just keep 0. And then on the bottom, we're going to add 300 pixels. So that means that there's a distance of 300 pixels from the bottom until it starts fading in. So if we go back now, we see our page is white. And that is actually because you need to define all of these in pixel or percentage values. So 0 doesn't work here. It needs to be 0 pixels. And I also notice right now that I added 300, but that means that it's actually 300 pixels from the bottom. So outside of your viewport when it starts happening, so we don't see it. So we actually want this to be minus 300 pixels because we want it to be 300 pixels inside of the viewport. And then if we would keep on scrolling, you will see the text is suddenly fading in and fading out while it is in view. Cool, right? And now we can simply reuse this component to make all of our elements fade in. And of course, we can still tweak that 300 pixel value. And maybe you want to even have this something that's dynamic. So you can control it, and maybe you have one that's 150 and the other is 300. But yeah, I guess you can do that yourself, right? Because I think for Apple's version, this already looks pretty neat. And if we would add a little bit more room to scroll at the bottom, then of course we would also start to see the fourth element visible as well. And one thing to note is also because we're using these while in view props, the animation simply kicks off even if you stop on scrolling. And depending on the thing you're creating, that might be what you want, because sometimes you might want to connect it to the scroll, but in other times you might not. For example, the fade in of the video, it stops if we stop on scrolling as well, because maybe it would look really awkward if it would still fade out. But for the text, Apple decided they did not want to have it stop halfway. So that's why we are using the while in view prop to simply kick off the animation and then forget about it. So and with that, I think it's actually time to skip this boring 3-column layout and start making this video cover. Because this animation is of course so much more cool than making a basic fading in 3-column layout. I guess you are able to do that yourself now. Now we have created the fade in component. So let's continue by adding in these video covers. So if we look at that carousel section, we see that the first carousel image kind of lies underneath the black background. And then it starts to scale down and you see a black background again. So this immediately tells me that the black background that we already have wrapped around both the main text or the use piece text as well as the hero, that's not the div that we can use for this one as well, because otherwise we can't recreate this effect where the black background starts to move away. So let's go back into our code. And then for now, we're gonna remove the 3-column layout. We'll love to see how you approach that though. And then this div that we're gonna use for the carousel will indeed stay outside of the black background color. But again, we're gonna copy this and go into section, and then for example, call this maybe video carousel.tsx. Video carousel. And then in there, we enter the carousel we had before. Then here we can add a video carousel. So this way we again have a nice place to focus. I also want to add a small div here for a second. So we have some height to scroll. So let's give this 300 viewport height as a height. So that way, if we go back, there's at least a little bit more room to scroll. If we then go into our carousel component, the first thing we need to do is also give this a background of black, which is our background color. And then we're gonna remove that container because it looks like pretty much the full content extends the full width. And then again, I like to start with scaffolding out the layout. So let's say there is a div here that has 3 large videos. And then we have 2 more carousels. And then we have 2 more carousels for the smaller ones. So with that, we pretty much created like these 3 rows, and let's just already fill them with some images, things like that, before we start positioning them. So because I already added a few images in here that we can use as movie posters, I also created a very small file that we can add right now called movies.ts. And that for now can serve like as our database, for example, because this way now we have like an array that we can use to get all of the movies data, but also 2 arrays that simply creates 2 random arrays. So at least the 2 small carousels at the bottom won't be too consistent or exactly the same. So let's make sure that we export all of that so we can use it. Export, export, export. Because then we can go back into our video carousel and we can simply import movies and just render 3 of them here. So let's start by adding 1 image source movies 0.poster. And of course, in a second, we will see if it makes sense to, of course, do this in a loop. But for now, we're just going to hard code it in there so we have some layout scaffold, and then we take it from there. So that means that we have 3 large posters here now, and then we can use the random arrays, random movies, to just create the smaller carousels. So let's already loop over them because it's quite a large set, of course. Movie. And then again, we have the image source movie.poster. Then we also need to add a key on there, movie.name. And because I actually use the same set 3 times, I can't have a unique key by only looking at the movie.name. So this is something that we have to work with now, but in a real world scenario, you would have like an ID, for example, that definitely is unique. But for now, we're actually also gonna extract the key, or the index, I mean, from the loop. And then we can combine that into a key for React. which isn't necessarily the way you want to do it, but in this case, at least we have unique IDs. And then we're gonna copy this one, and we're gonna do the exact same thing here as well, but then with the second set. And now if we go back, we at least see we already have some images. Unfortunately, they're not as beautiful as Apple's because I didn't want to get like any copyright claims. So for this, I'm already seeing that we probably will duplicate quite a bit for these two carousels. So I'm actually gonna copy this one out, and we're gonna create a small component, const small video carousel, for example. And that will return our gallery. And this takes in some movies, which imports the type that is also in the video file. And then we can use these movies here. And then we can simply use our video carousel and then say movies is random movie set 1. And we do the same for set 2. So this way, at least we already remove some duplication. But you see, instead of completely overthinking everything before I even start typing, I just start typing and then I start realizing, maybe it makes sense to already abstract this into a component. And sometimes it doesn't yet. So with that, we can start making our small carousel have a class name of flex. So it is flexbox, and maybe give it a gap of 3, for example. And then you will already see that it starts to put all of these images next to each other. But yeah, of course, we have scroll bar, things are way too big, that's not what we like, but it's already a step in the right direction. So first, let's add a div around our image so we can add a little bit more content in there. That also means that we need to copy our key and add that onto the div instead of the image. And then we're gonna add a class name on here. And then we're gonna give this a width of, for example, 30 viewport width. So it's like 30% of the viewport. And then you also notice that because we added a wrapper div around here, that actually it's now way smaller than the 30 viewport width. And that's because of the div. Now the image doesn't extend to its full size anymore because of like CSS resets that are in this project. So what we now also need to add onto our div is a shrink of 0. So our content won't shrink down anymore. And then you see that we get this scroll bar back, but we also have these images that are 30 viewport width. So a few things that you notice is, firstly, they all have different sizes, and that's not Apple style, of course. They make sure all of their images are exactly the same size. But in our case, we can actually use some CSS to also fix that. So that CSS is gonna be class name, width full, height full, and then we're gonna use the object cover again. And then all of a sudden you see that the images are all the same size. And it's not stretching them, but it is rather filling them in the available space. But now we also need to get rid of that scroll bar, of course. So for that, we're actually going to use overflow clip on our parent, and that will simply clip everything away for now. So there is no scroll bar, but you also are not able to reach the other ones anymore. But that is okay for now. Let's make the image also rounded 3 extra large. So, oh, that's way too much. Maybe we can make it 2. Yeah, because 2 gives us 1 REM, which is 16 pixels. And let's quickly check what Apple adds on there. They use 10 pixels. So let's go down 1 more to rounded XL. And then we also see that Apple's images are quite a bit smaller. So that seems to be around 25% of the viewport. So let's go with that for now. Or you know what, we can even simply get the exact size like you should. 210 pixels is the width and our viewport is 900. So 210 divided by 901 is 23%. Okay, so let's make it 23 viewport width. This, however, Apple has set it to a fixed size. So all of the images will always remain the same size, but I'm actually going to use a viewport width here. And I will show you in a second why I think that's really useful, because a lot of things become a lot simpler then. But again, Apple might not agree with that because they want to have full control of everything. Okay, that's at least for now what we do with the smaller galleries. Now let's go back to the large gallery and we're actually going to do the exact same thing. We're also going to add class name flex and maybe add a gap of 5 on there. Then you see that we already get some sort of images. However, we also need to go into those divs and also add class name shrink 0. And then we are going to add a fixed width to our images, which is also a viewport unit. So let's say we make them width 60 viewport width. And then we already have these images that are 60 viewport width in size. Let's also give them a rounded of 2 extra large so we get some rounded corners. However, because we are not setting that on the image, you don't see it yet. So there's 2 options for this. You could either add an overflow clip to the wrapper, because then the image will also clip itself to the rounded corners, or you add the rounded corners to the image. Potato, potato, in my opinion, either works. But what we still need to do as well is also make sure that we give the images the correct size. So let's also make them a width full and a height full, and then object cover. And then you already see that the image grew in size and that we also see the rounded corner at the bottom now. Then we're also going to give this a margin bottom of 5, so there is an equal gap between the elements as well as at the bottom. And then for now, we're also going to add overflow clip so we can't scroll and at least we see the grid. Now in this example, I'm not going to add carousels in there because that could also take us an hour to get that set up properly. But what I do want to focus on is this scroll animation. So that means that we at least need to have our main image or second image in the center of the viewport instead of further to the right. So what we are going to do though is make sure that we center this div so we can create that animation. So in order to do that, we need to do some translates. However, because we've also added an overflow onto this div is now the width of the screen and everything else is simply discarded. So what we need to do for this is we need to actually add another div around our main carousel. And then we're going to move this overflow clip to the parent. Because if we do that, we can now suddenly say left 50% and minus translate x of 50%. And then you suddenly see that the image is in the center. To repeat that, I can imagine that was pretty quick. Well, what I did is I moved the overflow clip to the parent. So what is overflowed is not the element itself, but we rather do that on the parent. So this way now this element is a lot wider than the viewport. And then we combine the left 50% with the translate x to center everything in screen. And then what I still want to do is I want to give this a little bit of padding. So let's give it a padding of 8 so we at least have some breathing room at the bottom. And one other thing we still need to add is make sure that our images are actually in the right aspect ratio. Because right now I'm just setting height full, width full, but we're not really specifying any height. So it's based on the highest image that is in there. So let's go to our divs and also add aspect video on there. So everything will become a 60:9 aspect ratio. And we're going to do the exact same for this small image as well. So now everything at least is a nice, perfect video aspect ratio. What I also notice is we need to make a small gap between the two galleries. So let's do that as well. We can wrap this inside of a div. And then we can say class name space y3, and then you see that we have the exact same gap. And finally, before we start doing the scale animation of this main image, I already want to add a very small animation to these smaller video posters as well. I don't want to make any complicated carousel that moves and adds, if it's at the end, it will move everything back to the beginning, because that will be a video on its own. So we're just going to add a very small keyframe animation here so we have something moving. But know that this is of course not the final result and the way Apple did this, but at least the thing moves and that makes it a little bit more visually interesting. So for that, let's go to our Tailwind config. And then I already created a custom keyframe animation. It simply moves it over the x-axis from 0 to 100, and we can use the CSS variable to define its duration. So that way we are able to set a custom duration for each of the carousels, so they seem to move at a different speed. Or they really move at a different speed. So let's go back to our carousel. And then on here, we are able to add the class name Animate carousel move. And by only doing that already, you see that the carousel starts to move. However, what you also see is again that we are moving a div that has overflow clip, so you simply don't see anything. So that means that we need to change this up a little bit and create a div around it. And that div will actually have class name overflow clip. So we can remove that from the child. And if you then refresh, you suddenly see that everything is moving and we're not seeing the end of the scroller. However, we now still need to set the custom duration so we are able to see them move at a different speed. And because we are using CSS variables to control that speed, what we now can do is we can wrap our carousel in another div and then only define the CSS variable. And that CSS variable, to remind you and mainly myself, was called duration. So we can then define that in square brackets and say duration colon, and then, for example, make it 68 seconds. And now because this carousel has a parent that defines this CSS variable, it will use actually that instead of the default that is 80 seconds. So if we refresh, you now see that they are moving at a different speed. And maybe you still want to tweak it. Maybe it's too big of a difference. Maybe we want to make it 74, for example. But you're now able to do that. And then they suddenly move at a different speed. Also, one thing you might want to change is also let them not start at the exact same position. So for that, we would be able to introduce just another CSS variable. Why not? What we, for example, could do is we could add a left where we use a CSS variable where we say carousel offset or 0 pixels. So then by default, it will be 0 pixels. But if the carousel offset is defined, it will actually use that as a left. So then we could go back to our wrapper and we could say carousel offset minus 32 pixels, just to pick a random number. Because then if you refresh, then we don't see anything yet. And that is because we also need to make our element have position relative for the left to work. And if you refresh, then you see that already this offset is applied and that both of these carousels have a different starting point. And with that, it's finally time to also make this a large carousel, scale up and fade in and do very fancy stuff. So let's do that next. So the question is, how are we then able to get this scale animation to work and to have this main image or main carousel appear underneath the other text? For that, we are again going to use CSS position sticky because I think it's again very useful here. So how I would approach this is the following. If we go back to our carousel, then we are actually gonna make this wrapper div that's only around the main carousel. We're gonna give that more height. So let's say we're gonna make that div have a height of 300 viewport height. That on itself won't do a lot because we will still see the main carousel and then we have a lot of nothingness and then we go back to the two smaller carousels. However, what if we start to combine that then with position sticky and even a negative margin? So let's say we take our main carousel and we wrap that inside another div. Then that div is gonna have a fixed height of height screen and we're gonna make it position sticky as well as top 0. So within the 300 viewport height, we have our main carousel that is the height of the screen and it will stick to the top of the page. So if it now sticks to the top of the page, you see that we are able to scroll, the carousel will stick to the top and eventually we will also get to the smaller carousels. Now let's say we also give this 300 viewport height div a negative margin top of minus 100 viewport height. And we're gonna write that differently because this is way clearer. So we put it up 100 viewport height, which means that it's actually positioned right underneath the div that's above it that has the USPs. Because then it will stick to the top of the page, everything will scroll out of view and the carousel will still be there. But of course, we should not see the carousel yet while it is behind the USPs. So for that, we're gonna need a little bit of z-index. So let's go back to our app and then we go to the wrapper div that actually wraps both the hero as well as the USPs. And then we're gonna give this position relative as well as a z-index of 10. And then we don't see the carousel, but if we keep on scrolling, you see that it is actually already there. And this is then what we can use to scale the image up and kinda give the impression that it was there all along. But before we can start doing some scaling, we still need to put it back in the center of the page. So for that, we go back to our carousel, and then we're gonna go to the div that's actually the height of the screen, because we're gonna use Flexbox to center the div in the center of the screen again. So let's make it display flex. And then we're gonna add item center to that div as well to put everything back in the center. But what you notice now is that it actually is not in the center, and that is because we're using left 50%, but we did not assign a position to it. And before the parent was a flexbox parent, that did work, but right now we really have to add that. So by adding position relative, everything is also back in the center, and now flexbox is doing its job to also vertically center the element. And if we now scroll back up, and then scroll back down, you see that the carousel is in place. And if we keep on scrolling, the element will become sticky, so it will stay in the center of the screen, or actually it's staying at the top of the screen, like you can see with this div. But because of the flexbox, the carousel itself is actually centered in the screen. And if you then keep on scrolling, eventually you will end up with the mini carousel. And of course, there's currently still a gap between the two, but we will make sure in a second that they're actually right underneath each other. But the first thing I now want to add is actually the scaling, so we can see some nice scaling happening before the other ones fade in and the small carousel is visible as well. So in order to add that animation, we are again using the use scroll hook from Framer Motion. So let's use that by adding const equals use scroll, and then we're going to import that from Framer Motion. And that also means that we need to have a ref. So let's create a carousel wrapper ref equals use ref, which again is null at first and is a HTML div element. And then we're going to take that ref and we're actually going to put that onto our div that is 300 viewport height, and it's actually pulled 100 viewport height up. So ref is equal to carousel wrapper ref. And then we're going to go into our use scroll hook and we're going to set target equal to carousel wrapper. Then we're also going to define a custom offset where we start from the start of the viewport and the start of the element all the way until the end of the element is at the start of the viewport. And that is again the variable that we can use to create the scale width. So let's create a const scale equals use transform. We're also going to import that from Framer Motion. And then we're going to use our scroll Y progress as the input. And as the first array, we're going to say 0.3, 0.5, and 0.66. So that means during the 30 to 50% step, we're actually going to fade it in or scale it down slowly. And then for the last step, we're going to accelerate it a little bit just to recreate Apple's design. So let's say, as for our scales, we're going to start at a scale of 3. Then we're going to go to 2.5, so that goes fairly slowly. And then we end up at scale 1 at 66%. And also the 66% is not chosen by accident. This is of course because we have a 300 viewport height. So that means once we're at the last 100 viewport height, that it will actually have completed its animation. So now we can take this scale and go towards the center image and turn that into motion.div. And then of course we need to import motion from Framer Motion. And then we can add a style tag on there where we add the scale. And now if we start scrolling, we should see that the image will start out scaled up and then it will scale down once the full carousel is visible. So let's see. The image starts big. And if we keep on scrolling, now you see that it slowly becomes smaller and smaller. And then it will pick up pace and then it will fall into place. And it's purely based on the scroll, so this is very smooth, and depending on how fast you scroll, the animation will also be faster. And that looks so cool, right? The only thing though, it might look like it's working right now, but as soon as we start to have a different kind of aspect ratio for our screen, things will start breaking. Let's for example take a look at this screen size. Here you see that the height is significantly higher than the width. And if we then scroll the image out of view again, you see that nothing happens. But it has been scaled and it will also scale down. However, it has reached the maximum scale of 2.5 that we set. Now we could of course make this scale a very large number so it scales up way beyond, but I don't think that's actually the right solution here. Because if we would do that, then in most of the cases, you would only see just a small portion of the image if it's fully scaled up. And actually you want to see as much as possible. So how can we solve that? Well, if we go back to our code, we actually see that we have added a width that's a viewport width unit. And there was actually a reason that I added this, because now I know that this image is always 60% of the width of the screen. So in order for this element to scale up to be the full width, so 100%, I actually need to scale it 1.66 times. So that already means that I actually, where I set the 2.5 as the scale that it should become, well, that's actually already way too large, at least for the width. But now the thing is, we also still need to know what then the height scale is. And if we then know both of these values, we should not make the X and Y scale being different, because that would again distort the full image. But what we simply should do is take the largest of these two values and then scale the image to that. So how do we know what the scale is for the Y-axis? Well, the first thing we need to know is the width and height of the screen. And for that, you can of course add your own use effect, which will look at the window size and add an event handler to, when it changes, update that value. But you could also, for example, install a package like React Use, which gives us a hook use window size, which gives us the width and height. So I'm going to opt for that, and we're actually going to install the React Use package. So let's pm add React Use. Then we're going to pm def again, and we can simply import this use window size function into our component. This use window size we can then use const width, height is equal to use window size. And then all of a sudden we have these two variables that we can use. Now to calculate that scale, I'm actually going to create a new variable called maximum scale, for example. Const maximum scale is use memo. So the dependencies will be the width as well as the height, because we're going to need them to do our calculation. And then we're going to import use memo from React, and then we are going to define a few variables. First, we're going to create const window y ratio is equal to the height divided by the width. So that will give us a number that tells us how much bigger or smaller the height is over the width. So if it's bigger, it will be a number, for example, like 1.5. If it's smaller, it might be 0.5. So then we can say const x scale is 1.667, because that was what we already calculated based on the viewport width. And then we're going to say const y scale is x scale times our window y ratio. So now we know if the window is larger, then also our scale should be larger, because we should scale up more to also fit it in there. And then we simply need to take the largest value of these two. So we can say return mat.max y scale and x scale. And now our maximum scale will be a number that is the maximum number that we need to scale to. So instead of adding the 2.5, we can then simply add that value in there. And then for our larger step, which will let us shrink a little bit down, we could, for example, say maximum scale times 1.1. And if we then go back, we actually notice that it's still not correct. And that is because I forgot one critical thing. We also need to take into account that the aspect ratio is different. So we need to incorporate the aspect ratio in our calculation as well. So we need to actually multiply this by 16 divided by 9. So that way we also incorporate the ratio, and because the height is smaller than the width. And if we check that, then we all of a sudden see that the image is the correct size of the window, and then it scales down into place. And also, if we now go back to desktop, you will see that we don't scale the image up way beyond what we would like, and that it also is still working on desktop. And then, I mean, this is again such a smooth animation, and it just looks really satisfying and is so fun to play with. So the next thing we still need to add though is also have the images on the outside of the center image fade in a little bit after the image falls into place. Just like we can also see in Apple's version here, because if you scroll down, you see that the outer images are not visible yet until the image falls almost into place, and then you see them slowly fade in. So for that, we can of course also use our scroll Y listener to also manipulate the outer two images. So let's say we, for example, want to create a variable called const posters opacity. That's also a use transform. And as an input, we're also going to use the scroll Y progress. And then as the target for the scroll distance we're interested in, we can, for example, say 0.64 and 0.66. So we have a very short moment where we fade in these elements. And then we're going to say opacity is 0 and then opacity is 1. Because now, almost at the end of the scale animation, we will also start fading in these images. So let's take the poster's opacity, and then we go towards these other two images. We're gonna convert them both into a motion.div. We do so for the last one as well. And then we're gonna say style is opacity, which is equal to the poster opacity. Copy that and also add that to the right image. And with that, you should see that if we scroll, and I always like to refresh with frame motion simply because there's some JavaScript involved, and that way I at least know I'm looking at the correct end state. But if you then scroll and you scale down, you see that the outside images are not there yet until you keep on scrolling, and now you see they are actually slowly fading in. And the only thing we still need to do is also add a small X translation, so we also see them move in from the outsides. So let's add const poster translate X left. And I'm just gonna copy this use transform because we wanna do it at the same time. And then we wanna set it at -20 pixels, for example, or we can even do that as a number, -20 and 0. And then we wanna do the exact same for the right side. But this time it should start as 20 and then end at 0. And then we can copy this X position and then add X, translate X left, as well as X and then translate X right. And if we then scroll, we should also see that the element moves in from the right side. And that's correct. And look at that, all of a sudden by combining all these small animations, things start to really come to life. And yeah, this is what makes frontend so much fun for me. It's like these small things. And now, before we start doing some responsive stuff, I still want to add two more things. First, of course, we need to make sure that this small carousel is also connected to the large carousel. And actually, if we look at Apple's example, you see that it actually fades in at the very last moment. So that's something we gotta add, but also you also see that the button on top of this main carousel also fades in when everything fell into place. So let's start with the first one, and that is making sure that we put the bottom slider at the right position. And in order to do that, we're gonna need a little bit of mod, because what we need to do is we need to pull up this slider to pull it up to be right underneath the large carousel. But for that, we need to know what this distance is. And the distance is the height of the screen minus the height of the carousel, and then whatever is left divided by 2. So I hope that makes a little bit sense, but the reason we need to do that is because the wrapper page has the height of the screen, and that is needed to make our sticky logic work and center it in the page. So in order to have it end up right at the end, we need to kind of have a negative top margin. Let's see if we can add that in. So let's start by adding a negative top margin, and to start, just let's say it's -300 pixels. And then you see the carousel is kind of pulled up. But it's not there until you keep on scrolling and you're at the end of the sticky div, then it's actually in place. Otherwise it will keep on scrolling up because it's kind of further down the page and you're just scrolling up the page. But again, like I said, we need to find out how much we actually need to pull it up. So for that, we're gonna need a little bit of JavaScript calc. So firstly, we know that the width of the large image is 60 viewport width. So we have 60 viewport width. And if we then want to know what the height of that element is, we actually should multiply it by 16 divided by 9. So if we would multiply this by 16 divided by 9, we do get a number that is actually the height in viewport units of the carousel. But by doing that, we're still not there. Because if we have that number, we need to subtract that from the 100 viewport height unit, because that is actually what the full screen is. So that means we're going to say 100 viewport height minus this number, but we also need to divide that number by 2 because you have that same portion at the top of the carousel as well as underneath it. So if we say divided by 2 and then either multiply this by -1 or we add a minus in front of the margin top, which also makes it negative, then we should have a number that is actually correct. And if we check, we indeed see that we were correct. So of course, this took me quite a bit to figure out the mod for this because, well, I'm not a mathematician, but I got there. So the fact that I now tell you this in 10 seconds, that doesn't mean that it's that easy. Things like this just take a little bit of time, but also you can get there if you just take that time. So that negative margin is actually the only thing we need to get this to work. And also, of course, this is a little bit complicated. So you could, for example, decide to put this into a CSS variable that you can use so it's at least more readable. Or maybe you create a custom class that you give a right name so it's more recognizable. Do whatever you like with this to make sure that it's readable for other people as well. But then the only thing missing still is a correct gap at the top of this element. So for that, I'm actually going to add a padding top of 5, which is the exact same as the gap between the other images. Or maybe we can even make it 4 to have it just a little bit smaller. But then the carousel is in the right place. And the scrolling up behavior is simply happening because, like I said, you're still scrolling on the page while the other carousel is static. So that means the only thing we then need to do is fade in these smaller carousels at the very last moment instead of having them always visible. So, and again, looking at Apple's example, what you see is once everything fell into place, the fading in of the small carousels just keeps on happening and is not attached to your scroll anymore. So I think we're gonna recreate the exact same thing. So for that, we're gonna use a new hook that we haven't used before. That hook is use motion value event. With this hook, we are able to listen to a change event of a motion value and we're able to respond to that. And why is that useful? Well, let me tell you. Let's say we want to create some state that kind of resembles the current state, status, or variant in frame of motion terms of the carousel. So let's say const carousel variant and set carousel variant. That is use state, which is just the React use state. I'm going to import that. And we're going to say inactive. Could come up with any name you want. And then as values that are possible, we're going to add inactive as well as active. And then we are going to use this use motion value event. We're going to listen to scroll Y progress, and that will get a function that gives us the progress as an argument. And then again, Copilot is already helping us. If the progress is above a certain threshold, we're going to set it to active, otherwise we'll set it to inactive. So in this case, the progress should be 0.67, which is right after the element has faded in. Oh, and of course I see all these errors now, and that is because we need to add what type of event we want to listen to, and then the third argument is that function. So as I was saying, we're then going to listen to the progress number that is actually the same number as our scroll Y progress. And we're going to say if it's larger or equal to 0.67, we're going to set it to active and otherwise inactive. And now you're saying, okay, but why are you now going to use these variants, or what are you even going to do with them? Well, I'm going to take them and I'm going to turn our most outer component into a motion.div as well. And what I'm then doing is I'm going to take that carousel variant and I'm going to say animate is equal to carousel variant. So what that is going to do is it's going to set the animate property of this element to our current variant that we've created. On its own, that won't do anything. However, we are now able to go into our other animations, for example, our main carousel, and we can do something based on that. So if we turn the wrapper element of our small carousels into a motion.div as well, we can now add a property on here called variance. And then we can say visible, where opacity is 1 and Y is 0. And it should be variance with an S. And of course, it should be active as well as inactive, like we specified above, not visible and hidden. And then we're going to say as inactive, opacity 0 and a Y 20. And the reason this works, because we're now only setting the variance and what should happen in which variant. But the reason that works is because any parent of a motion div that sets a specific active variant is inherited by all its children. So the current active variant is also set on this child, or at least it knows which variant is active. So that's why we are able to set some styles based on that variant. So if we then would go back, refresh one more time and scroll down, you will see that the carousel now simply fades in. It might be a little bit fast, but of course we have control over that. We can go back to the div, set a transition, and set a duration to 0.4, for example. And then you see that all of a sudden it's very slowly fading in. But like I said, it's not connected to your own scroll anymore. Once the main image has landed into the carousel, everything else will simply kick off. And the only thing that should kick off, and that is why I use that variant, is also seeing the buttons on top of the bigger carousel. So let's go back to our carousel. And then we're gonna go to our center image and we're gonna add a new div. That div, we can, for example, set the title, which is a paragraph, best video title ever. And we're also gonna add in our button that says watch now. That size will be small, I guess. And then we're gonna make this position absolute, left 0, bottom 0, and width full. And of course, you could also use CSS grid here, by the way, instead of position absolute. Position absolute is kind of the old school solution here, but yeah, I'm old, I'm gray, I know. Mama. Anyway, position absolute is what I'm going to choose for, which means that I'm going to add position relative to the wrapper. And then you already see that we have the element visible, but of course we need to do some flexbox magic still. Flex space between, no, justify between. So everything is spaced between. Then we're also going to give this a padding of 5, for example. I'm going to make it text white and maybe text large. And I see that the button is definitely bigger. Is it actually? Oh yeah, it is. And we're also going to make items center, so the text and the button are both vertically in the center as well. Now the only thing we need to do is add a similar variant logic so it also fades in at the exact same time. So let's go back to that div. Then we turn it into a motion.div, and then we're going to add the variants on there as well. In this case though, we're only going to set active is equal to opacity 1 and inactive is equal to opacity 0. So we're not going to add a translate on the y-axis. And I see I did not use any camel casing, so it's going to be inactive like this. But then if we go back, you see that if we scroll down, that also now the video title fades in. And as you can see, we're now only using one variant to control all of these different animations. So also, if you, for example, would turn this into a real carousel, you could even add the arrows based on this variant as well. So let's also still add a little bit of padding at the bottom of our carousel wrapper, because I think it's a little bit little. Because looking at Apple's variant, of course, there's still a button there, but yeah, I guess you can imagine how you add a button yourself, right? Because I think this already brings many of the great things that Apple created for us together. And well, this in my opinion already looks really nice. The only thing we still have to fix is also make this work on all different breakpoints. But apart from that, I think that's where this rebuild will end. So let's start by making this responsive as well. So let's start back at the top. And if I look at the main title, I see that the Apple TV text is actually scaling down a little bit. Oh no, it actually looks like it is, but it is not. It's always 19 pixels. Okay, so the next text, that is our hero title that goes from 72 pixels down to 40 pixels. And if we go to our Tailwind config, we see that that's from 5XL to 4XL. So let's go back into our hero, and then we're gonna say 5XL is only from medium and up, and then by default it will be 4XL. Then the button seems to be always the same, and the same goes for the watch on Apple TV. Then we continue to the USBs, 28 pixels on mobile, 40 on desktop. So we're gonna go to our USBs. That's text 4XL, and 3XL will be the mobile version then. So that will be medium and up, and then text 3XL. And then probably the hardest thing to make responsive will be the carousel. Because if we make that smaller, you see that all of a sudden the image gets a totally different aspect ratio. And well, we took that aspect ratio into account in our calculations, so this can be an interesting one. And then I think the width for our carousel items at 60 viewport width is actually still okay. At least let's leave it at that for now. But the most important thing that's going to change, of course, is the aspect video. Because this is a 16:9 aspect ratio, but on mobile, it's more something like 9:16. So let's go into the aspect video. And then we're going to change all three of them to be on medium and up. And then we're going to say, otherwise, the aspect ratio is 9/16. So this way, if we now go back to our carousel and go smaller, we should already see that everything now has a different aspect ratio, but also that of course everything is broken. But we can fix this rather quickly. The first thing we have to do is go to our small carousel and also make sure that this class is also only active from medium and up. And then if we're not medium and up, we're actually gonna set this to 9/16. So that way our calculation is now also updated and reflects the new aspect ratio. But then if we add that and we refresh, we actually see that the end position of the smaller carousel is not correct. And I had to stop the video for a few minutes here because it had to work and then it didn't. And of course, everything was correct except me. I made a small mistake. If we go back to this calculation, we actually see that what I wanted to do is I wanted to take this whole calculation and divide that by 2. But right now, because of all the brackets, I completely messed up and made a different calculation. So, well, this is probably proof that you might want to abstract this away into a different kind of class so you at least know for sure that it is right. But because I don't want to make this video any longer than it already is, I'm actually going to go ahead and simply change the calc here. Because what you see, I moved around some brackets. So I evaluate this first. I also switched around 9 divided by 16 by 16 divided by 9 because it should actually be reversed to get the correct answer. But then we subtract the 100 viewport height from this value, and only then we take all of this and divide that by 2. So we're also going to copy this calc and move that to this calculation. And then we need to say 9 divided by 16. And then both of the calculations are actually correct. So if you now look, you see that the carousel is actually in the right position. And if we scroll, everything looks correct. And if we go back to desktop again, you will also see that everything is now in the right place, which it seemed to be before, but that was more of a coincidence than me writing the correct code. So if we look at that, then you already see that also the animation now works perfectly. But if we go just a little bit bigger, we kind of get these really large awkward cards. So let's, instead of using the 60 viewport width, make this a hard-coded fixed pixel value. So that means that the 60 viewport width that we're actually using, we're going to select them and we're going to make it apply only from medium and up. And then we're going to give this a hard-coded width of 300 pixels. So that also means we need to go down into our class name and also add a 300 pixels in there, at least for mobile. And then for desktop and up, we keep the 60 viewport width. So then you see that at least the images become a little bit smaller again, and the position is still correct because also the carousel is taking that into account. And if we go even smaller, of course, if you would go really small, then it won't fit. But if we go towards a mobile size, for example, you see that everything still fits in. And then one other thing that we still need to change is also make sure that we position the title and the button differently. So let's go in to our button component and make that a flex call. And then from MD and up, it will be flex row. So now actually everything is positioned on top of each other. And it means that we need to give this a little bit of spacing. So the justify between is also from medium and up. And then we're going to add a gap of 4. And on medium, it will be a gap of 0. And now you see that everything has some nice spacing as well. Also for the smaller cards, because they are using viewport width as well, I think that looks a little bit too small. So let's go ahead and also make that from medium and up as well. And otherwise it will be with 60 viewport width as well. Maybe 50, 40, something like that. Yep, this already looks so much better. And then all of a sudden we also have this responsive looking page. And I think that with that, I'm actually gonna end this rebuild because we touched on so many different topics, we built so many things, and I really hope that you watched till the end because it took me a lot of time to create this for you, but I also think there's many great real world scenarios and use cases that I was able to show you and teach you, and that I was able to show you how you can make really cool websites like this. I really tried to teach you best practices like you would also use that in a real company. But also, like I said during this build as well, if you would keep on continue building on this, there's probably points where you would start to refactor even more. For example, the buttons, there might be the container classes that you're going to make a small and a large variant. There are so many things that we can still improve. But I think as long as you keep the mentality of keeping improving your website and not accepting something as a fact that it has been built this way and it will stay forever, then you will keep on looking back on your code and improve small parts here and there, and it will just grow naturally and become better over time. Don't set out by thinking you need to make the best website ever and think of the best architecture you can come up with, because you don't know what all of the things are that you will be building. So just start small and keep the open mindset to keep on improving things. And with that said, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. And I would really appreciate a like if you reach the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I will see you in the next video.